The other one was a very simplified way of looking at things, and that is why I believe there is a flaw, and I believe that flaw should be looked at.
Mr. Mayor, to try and help, I think if it is proved that there is a mathematical and a fundamental error in the statistics and data that we have published, and I accept Julie Glaser's comment that it was on the website after being to the steering group, then of course the purpose of the consultation process, and in my introduction I did invite all members of this council to participate and engage, and that is the sort of consultation response we will be looking for. And if it is a fundamental mathematical mistake, then in answer to Alan's first point, that will be the receipt of serious consideration, and it will be amended and changed.
Thank you. Councillor Duffy?
No, my question really, Councillor Fylde has answered it with his last comment.
Thank you. Councillor Ashton?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think we're missing the point here. You know, I'd like to see more employment land in Fylde. At the moment, this country is going through a recession, and I'd like to see more private sector jobs created. With a shrinking public sector, and quite rightly a shrinking public sector, we should be creating more private sector jobs. High youth unemployment, shortage of hours of work for people. I want to see us building more factories, more office space in Fylde to make sure we do combat the recession that this country is going through. I myself have never been unemployed, but it must be absolutely terrible to be. So if we can go some way to help get people into work, then we'll have done a good job. And to argue about statistics tonight, to me, is totally wrong. We're missing the big picture. Let's get on with this local plan. Let's deliver these houses and this employment land and these jobs that we want to create. And let's get on with the consultation process. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Ashton. Councillor Aiken. Sorry, completely went.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Agree entirely with Councillor Ashton. Prosperity. Some months ago, last year, in fact, Fylde Borough Council undertook an appointment of some consultants who came back and told us that each year we were short of just over 2 hectares of employment land. Now, I think if somebody had come along and said, hang on a minute, there's errors in this particular document, we would have looked very, very hard at this, because quite honestly, we want to make sure that everything is watertight. There's no easy answer to housing figures and housing numbers, etc., etc. You can debate this all night ad infinitum. Someone will say, that's not right, that's not right, that's not right. In fact, we have tried our best to make sure that everything is right to the point. We've even spoken to a chief inspector and planning advisory service people. Councillor Fylde has even gone down to London to try and ask, is there any way we can make the numbers less? We've been told we have to backdate our numbers to 2003. Well, most people turn around and say, well, that is a long way to go backdated. We can't help it. It's not our fault. We have a responsibility, members, on behalf of the people of Fylde to do things that are right. I will be voting for the amendments, or against the amendments, and I think looking at errors, the errors should have been looked at many months ago, and Councillor Oates should have been right at the point, this is wrong, let's look at it again, please be very careful.
Thank you, Councillor Aitken. I think it was pointed out at the time, actually. Councillor Duffy?
Just a quick point. Did I understand that correctly, Councillor Aitken, that if it is shown that there is an actual error, then you'd rather just get on with it anyway and accept the fact that that should have been pointed out before, and since it wasn't pointed out a few months ago, then we'll just ignore it now? That seemed to be what you were saying.
Councillor Aitken.
Semantics, Councillor Duffy. If people could prove that there was in fact an error, they should have shown it many months ago so that we could have analysed it and got back to the independent people who are looking at the actual numbers. I mean, clearly the error should have come forward by now. So I'm saying that there is no error.
I'm going to take
Mr.
Councillor...
Mayor, can I just reiterate what I said earlier? If there is a fundamental mathematical error that means that the figure which I quoted, 49 hectares of land needed in the plan period to 2030, if there is such an error, during the consultation process, that will come to light and we will react accordingly.
Thank you, Councillor Fylde. I'll just take Councillor Rhodes and then I'm going to put it to the vote.
Well, I have to say I'm quite appalled by the ignorance shown by members of some members of the DC committee. We did actually point out at the time of the employment land study that there were errors and we were ignored. We queried the minutes, and to say that this has been endorsed, it may have been endorsed by the majority of the LDF group. I don't know, because we've never taken votes, so it's very difficult to know who did and who didn't endorse. It is quite a complicated mathematical thing to look into, Councillor Aitken, and I will say to you, if you expect me to look into it within a very short space of time, I would ask why you, as the chairman of the DC committee, have not been more on the ball yourself, as well as a portfolio holder. However, I am saying I believe there is a mathematical error in this. All I'm asking is that it is checked out. If it's proven that there isn't a mathematical error, then this will go ahead. But if it's proven that there is, we should not leave that in there. And I agree that we need prosperity, but the people of this borough do not want to see open countryside lost if it needn't be. And that's the point I'm making.
Thank you, Councillor Rhodes. Have you got anything else you want to say, Councillor Fylde, before I put this to the vote? Thank you.
No, Mr. Mayor.
I'll just read out the amendment prior to the vote. Employment land, housing need and housing numbers. We believe that the evidence base is, in part, flawed in relation to the housing need numbers, housing numbers and employment land assessment, and therefore cannot be relied upon. We move that these three areas should be reassessed and corrected. The employment land study documentation has not gone out to public consultation and is not appended to this plan. We believe that it should be. So if you're supporting the amendment, you are for it. If you're against the amendment, you're against it. Thank you.
Do you have 5 members? Thank you. Thank you. That will be a recorded vote.
Okay, the Mayor.
For.
Councillor Silverwood. For. Councillor Ackers. Councillor Aitken. Councillor Akeroyd. Councillor Andrews. Councillor Armitt. Councillor Tim Ashton. Councillor Beckett. Councillor Brickles. Councillor Chedd. Councillor Chew. Councillor Clayton. Councillor Craig Wilson. Councillor John Davis. Councillor Donaldson. Councillor Duffy. Councillor Eaves. Councillor Fazakerley. Councillor Fiddler. Councillor Ford. Councillor Goodman. Councillor Goodrich. Councillor Harper. Councillor Howard Henshaw. Councillor Karen Henshaw. Councillor Hodgson. Councillor Jakes. Councillor Little. Councillor Barbara Nash. Councillor Edward Nash. Councillor Odes. Councillor Pounder. Councillor Presswich. Councillor Redcliffe, Councillor Rigby, Councillor Speak, Councillor Threlfall, and Councillor Wilder. The amendment is lost with 22 against and 17 for.
Thank you. Can we move on then? Are there any more amendments? Thank you, Councillor Rhodes.
Yes, I'd like to make an amendment on policy H3, affordable housing. Paragraph 2, we move that the wording of the last sentence be altered to the provision of affordable housing will be to meet the need for those settlements. At the moment, the way the policy is worded would mean that St Anne's, Lytham, Kirkham, Wesham, Freckleton and Wharton would have to take the need of the borough. We believe that we should take our own need, and the worry we have there is that as those of us that know DC, very often when we get applications in for Lytham and St Anne's, developers will give a sum rather than provide affordable housing. And that can mean that we could find that certain areas could be ghettoised, and that's something I think that we should seek to avoid. So that is the reason that I'm moving an amendment to the wording, and I do have a seconder.
Thank you, Councillor Rhodes.
Mr Mayor, through the Chair, can I ask Councillor Rhodes to identify which page that housing policy is? Just assume you've seconded.
Yeah, can you second it?
Page 105. And just a quick question: is this something that's been added at a later stage? Because I don't remember that being in there. Was that in the original document that we first considered?
I've got the original document, and it's not the same as the one that's been quoted by Councillor Rhodes. And just to... Mr Mayor, if I can have your indulgence while I just read the policy H3.
Yep, that's fine.
Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Thank you.
I'm quite sympathetic to that comment, and again, like in the final answer to your previous amendment, that comment that I am sure you'll make in the consultation process will be considered and given some sort of weight and authority. It's always been the policy, ever since the concept of the Fylde Borough, the planning process delivering affordable housing. The concept has been agreed universally within the planning committee that you try and provide affordable housing in the areas where it is needed. And you raise the issue of the commuted sums. And what has happened over many years, not so much recently, that whereby commuted sums was a means of providing affordable housing in St Anne's, or on the backs of a development in St Anne's, but the commuted sum would be used to provide housing elsewhere. And even though St Anne's has been described as having the greatest need of affordable housing, what was happening is that developers got away with commuted sums, didn't provide the much needed affordable housing in St Anne's, but the commuted sums enabled houses to be built elsewhere. So I do have some sympathy with that. And I am sure if you made that response in the consultation exercise, I will give an assurance to Councillor Rose that we will deal with that effectively.
Thank you, Councillor Fydler. Does anybody else wish to speak on this amendment? Sorry, then we'll take the vote.
Can I just make a point, Madam Chair, before you take the vote? In terms of not accepting the amendment doesn't mean to say that that will not be considered in the consultation process.
Thank you. Can we do that by a show of hands then, please? Those in favour of the amendment? Against?
That amendment fails. There were 21, there were 18 in favour of the amendment and 21 against.
Oh, I'll get this in a minute. Thank you. Are there any more amendments? Councillor Rhodes?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. At the very back of this plan, there are some maps, and there is a map of land assessed but not included in the plan. It's the last 2 pages. We move that these sites be removed from the maps as they give an indication that development would be acceptable in these areas. And I do have a seconder.
Thank you. Councillor Duffy?
Yes, I'm happy to second this motion as well. Thank you.
It's the one that is the land assessed but not included in the plan. So any map with land assessed but not included in the plan, I believe those areas that are not included in the plan should be taken out, because it could give an indication to developers that it's ripe for development. We could get speculative development in.
For clarification, it's the one with orange splodges on it. Does anybody wish to speak on this subject?
Mr. Mayor, I think...
Sorry. Oh.
Mr. Mayor, it may help Council and Councillor Rhodes if I again invite Julie Glaser to make a comment on the map that she refers to.
Thank you.
This was very clear advice from the Planning Advisory Service that we must include the sites that we discounted and set out very clearly why we discounted them. And this is in the table at the back of the document. I'm looking at pages, for example, 196, 197. It says on the left-hand side, H6, land at Peel housing, recommendation under that column that the site is not included in the plan, and we set out very specifically why, and this is for the purpose at a later stage of the examination in public of us setting out now why we're not including these sites in the plan, so it is very clear to developers coming along trying to get their sites in that it's not acceptable for development to take place there. So we've very specifically included this on the recommendation of the Planning Advisory Service. We were sent away and told to rework this part of the document, and we did that, and it then got their approval, and they agreed with what we'd said, what we'd done, and said we've made a good job of it. So that's why it's there. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Aiken.
Mr. Mayor, I'm quite disappointed with Councillor Oates on this one. When I first saw the areas, I thought, we can defend these. That's all I want to say.
Councillor Oates.
Well, I'm glad that Councillor Aitken has so much confidence, because I don't, because I assume this goes back to the SHLA, and ever since the SHLA document came into existence, this borough has been up for grabs to any developer that wants to come along. So I'm glad you've got confidence. I don't share it.
Mr.
Councillor
Mayor,
Aitken.
I'm sure Councillor Fiddle will say very much what I'm going to say. Every area in the country has to have a SHLA. In other words, areas which could be developed by developers. These areas which are on this map, we can all look at these and say, and any councillor who's not on the Development Management Committee can look at these and say, if it's there's an application in, when we do get our 5-year housing supply figure and our local plan adopted, we can turn around and say, in the period from now until 2030, we're defending these. Developer, keep away.
Thank you, Councillor Aitken. Councillor Fiddler.
well, Mr. Mayor, as you know, and members of the Planning Committee realise, the SHLA has caused great difficulty ever since it was published. But it's published because it's a statutory document. And if the government are saying to you that you have to build 7,000 houses, obviously the other side of the coin is that you've got to have an awareness of where you're going to build those 7,000 houses. And the SHLA is and people misalign the SHLA, but the SHLA is simply a technical exercise which identifies land adjoining, adjacent to existing settlements that can be developed. And the methodology of the SHLA process is that it asks the main prime question. It has got to identify land that can deliver housing sites, and the operative word is now. I don't think you need to be, I think members do worry unduly about the SHLA, and Councillor Oates repeats her criticisms time and time again. I don't think there's any need. Every authority in the land has an exercise very similar to the one we conducted. In terms of the answer given to the amendment by Julie Glaser, I think that just shows you to what depth one has to approach this exercise. That here we are, we've got identified sites, and we have they are identified on the maps described, and we have to go through the hoops to explain to a government inspector the reasons why we feel they should not be included. So not only do we have land that we want to include and ought to be included, we've got to describe and explain to a third party the reasons why this sort of land, the identified land and maps, are not being accepted.
Thank you, Councillor Fiddler. Does anybody else wish to speak? Sorry. Who? Sorry. Right. Can we go to the vote then, please? Can we do this by a show of hands, please? Right. Against the amendment?
That amendment is lost. There were 16 for the amendment and 23 against, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Are there any more amendments? Thank you, Councillor Speak.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I would like to move that policy GD2, and it's on page 69. I'd like to move that this policy should apply to several areas of the borough, not just Ray Green. We would like to see this policy amended to reflect this, and I'm talking about areas of separation. And I have a seconder. Area of separation, I really do support what is outlined, this area of separation between Ray Green and Kirkham, and it is so very important. We need to protect the character and the distinctiveness of that area, which is described as a narrow strip of open land. But within Fylde there are many areas which have the rural character and distinctiveness and valued locally as part of the local green infrastructure. This is our opportunity to highlight and include into the consultation document a process where we can protect parishes with an area of separation. I have looked very closely around the Fylde, and I have a number of sites which I would like to be considered, and I don't think it should be just Ray Green, again the area of separation between Ray Green and Kirkham. And because I am fearful that before 2030 there's going to be a huge amount of development. For instance, in trails, I feel like developers are going to be attacking from Mowbray Lane down towards trails, and from Kirkham, Durbridge, up to trails. And for instance, just one instance, I would like to see an area of separation between trails and Kirkham that goes right up and in between Wesham and trails, because it is important to us as it is to Ray Green and Kirkham. Thank you.
Thank you. Have we got a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Chu.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, I'm happy to second that proposition. And if I could just add to that, I feel terribly afraid that our villages and small settlements will lose their character and individuality, and eventually our loss of traditions, local traditions. Areas of separation are helpful in keeping that physical space to stop our settlements joining together and just becoming one homogenous mass, particularly with our boundaries with other boroughs. In my ward, I've got a long boundary with Wyre, and they're intending building right up to that boundary, and I know that Trails and Preston intends building right up to Trails at Clifton and Trails. So I think that these areas of separation have become extremely important, and I would like to see this amendment go through, and I do hope this council will speak as one with this one. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Chu. Councillor Fylde.
Like the previous amendment, I agree with the sentiment expressed by the proposer and seconder. The concept of area of separation is relatively new. Historically, we've relied on greenbelt designation to be the major buffer between the adjoining settlements and neighbourhoods, and physically prevents coalescence. I also agree with the sentiment that it shouldn't be simply protecting that area between Ray Green and Kirkham. And Councillor Speak refers to the fact that she has several sites within the borough that could benefit from this type of designation, and I agree. But the way to deal with that concept isn't through amendment this evening. The way to deal with that is that for Councillor Speak to make representations in the consultation process, identifying those sites that she refers to, and I give her a commitment from the portfolio holder that they will be considered sympathetically.
Thank you, Councillor Fylde. Does anybody else wish to speak? Councillor Andrews.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Can I just say on this area of separation, just how, can you hear me? Just how important these areas are when you live in a village. It's something that's not very important when you live in a town, but it becomes hyper important when you drive through the country to where you live. So it's very difficult not to support this. What I would like to ask is it any way it's possible to designate this land as green belt, or is it any way possible to strengthen this area of separation?
Mr. Mayor, the simple answer is no. The local plan exercise we're carrying out does not afford the opportunity to review the existing Greenbelt policy. That is outside the remit of the local plan.
Thank you. Does anybody else wish to speak on this amendment? Councillor Pounder.
Yes, I'd like to ask the portfolio holder. I, again, like Councillor Andrews, come from a village area, and development is taking part in that. Can I have the portfolio holders' agreement that he will look at all areas and not just the Ray Green one, where there is this area of separation will come?
Councillor Fiddler.
Probably the answer is no. And I would hate to think that members who are from a particular parish are being subjected to current planning applications would like to use this concept of area of separation to prevent all out of settlement developments which are adjoining the boundary of existing settlements. I think there are particular areas within the borough that would benefit from this area of separation. But if you think that that will be a means whereby you will be able to counteract the direction given to you by the National Planning Policy Framework, where you are asked to approve sites which are, in governments to speak, sustainable. In the main, I feel if you try to apply areas of separation in a very liberal way, you would fall foul of the concept of delivering houses on the edge of settlements.
Thank you, Councillor Fiddler. Councillor Speak.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Objective 2, to improve the environment. Retaining the identity, character and setting of rural villages. So that is very important to all of us, I know. But I am going to write, and I am going to put my list down. But, for instance, I do realise that areas of separation, for instance, between Rosica and Elswick, it's a nonsense. And there are areas where we'd all like to see an area of separation and it wouldn't make sense. But I think when you've a fast developing area like Kirkham and Wesham, it is a worry. And I think there is a genuine need for some areas of separation. But I agree with Councillor Fiddler, we can't just put them willy-nilly. We've got to be sensible and practical and responsible. So, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Fiddler.
Councillor Speak is the champion of the rural scene and often visits this concept. I think we all agree that the nature and character of our rural settlements is something which we ought to preserve and keep. And the document that you've got before you this evening is the draft preferred option part 1. Part 2, and no one's referred to it, is how this planning authority will deal with small applications in the rural areas and how we deal with developments in these small settlements that Councillor Speak is so concerned of. So when we deal with part 2, and I hope it is sooner rather than later, because it is an emotional issue when we get applications in DM committee that refer to these rural settlements, as soon as we can, we ought to be able to produce the part 2 of this document, preferred options for the small rural settlements, and there will be an opportunity for people, like-minded people to council speak, to input and do a bit to preserve the character that she describes.
Thank you, Councillor Fylde. Does anybody else wish to speak before we put the amendment to the vote? Thank you. So can we indicate for the amendment? Against?
That amendment is lost.
Thank you. Can we have the figures for that, please?
Beg your pardon, Mr. Mayor. There were 17 for the amendment and 18 against.
Were there any abstentions? Thank you. I just wasn't looking that way at the time. Are there any further amendments? Councillor Clayton.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'd like to return back to the point made earlier about the consultation process, if I may. And for members' benefit, I'm referring now to an amendment I wish to place under recommendation 2 at paragraph 3.2, which is in the report at page 5. Throughout the whole of the report, Mr. Mayor, there is great emphasis on the public consultation process through many formats, whether it be through email, letter or whatever. And in view of the earlier comments made by Councillor Fylde of it not being an easy consultation, I would like to make an amendment to that paragraph at 3.2 by the simple insertion of a further sentence. I think it's very important that we give as much guidance to whoever is going to make any completion to ensure that we do not throw the baby out with the bathwater. And my amendment would read at the end of paragraph 3.2, it would read, in all methods of communication and at every opportunity, full guidance will be provided on the format in which comments should be submitted. My intention there is to steer people to put their comments in, as Councillor Fylde has recommended, in quality planning terms rather than just terms that are not within that category. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I do have a seconder.
Thank you. Thank you. Councillor Beckett. Thank you. Councillor Fylde.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I am quite happy, and in my brief introduction I did say that when it came to the consultation process, different to the main body of the preferred option, that I was going to be flexible. And in my response to Councillor Clayton's first comment this evening, that the concept of lay people understanding how to engage with the consultation process is a difficult one. To make it more productive and helpful, I support that amendment, and I'm prepared to accept that as an amendment this evening rather than go through the consultation process, because that would be self-defeating. It would not have the opportunity to kick in. So because of that reason, I gladly support that amendment.
Thank you, Councillor Fylde. Councillor Chedd.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have a question I'd like to ask in relation to this. We've already conducted this consultation, and I've heard a number of times that a good number of responses to the original consultation were rejected on the grounds that they weren't in planning speak. What I'd like to know, if the figures are available, is what the numbers were. How many responses we got in, how many of those were accepted and how many were rejected? Thank you.
Is it possible, not Councillor Glaister, Julie?
We didn't reject any responses. There's a full consultation report that went to the local plan steering group that detailed, it summarised all the responses. We didn't reject anything that anybody said. No, that's definitely not happened. I mean, with respect to this point, I would say that we have been working hard this week designing a comments form that does ask people to say whether they're commenting on about a specific site, a policy that's in the document, or a specific paragraph. And we also ask them to say if they've got any supporting evidence or information relating to the comment that they're making. So we're trying to encourage people to say why they've made the comment they're making. What's difficult for us is when we just get a comment and it's an opinion. What we need is some more information, really. That's what we're looking for, sound evidence. I know it's difficult for a member of the public to understand that concept, but if somebody gives us a piece of information, for example, about a site, something that we didn't know before, a piece of evidence, perhaps it can't be accessed, or there has been a flood there, or something like that, we would look into that. That is a piece of relevant information, something that we didn't know before. But, you know, that's what we need, facts and figures. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Councillor Armitt.
Thank you. Whilst I have great sympathy with this idea, I'm not sure how... Can I ask the question of how you practically think this might work? We've heard a lot of debate tonight about very, very experienced members of the DM committee don't know what they're talking about sometimes, it seems, and are self-arguing about bits and pieces of detail. And I know on DM committees we have great debates on sometimes getting into the detail of it. We can't possibly train the people who in that level to what they're going to respond on. So what form will this guidance take? What level will it be at that you think would be practical, that would get into DM speak and yet not leave it to a layman in how are they going to do it? So I can see a sympathy that what you want to achieve. I can't see how on earth and what level of work are we putting on officers here to try and create something that's going to be training the public in how to respond in DM speak.
Would you like to come back, Councillor Clayton?
It's a very difficult one to answer that, but I think our officer, Julie Glaister, has already touched on the point that she's already realised that there is some guidance necessary, and I'm simply asking that wherever possible, I understand and realise that it may be difficult to put things into planning speak, but I'm just fearful that if someone responds quite genuinely and maybe haven't been given any guidance whatsoever, then that input will have very, very little weight. And as Councillor Fylde has said earlier, I'm sure that if there was at least some guidance, I appreciate you cannot train the public to do it, but at least I think we've got a responsibility to endeavour to make sure that as much information as possible is put forward. That is the best we can hope for. And that's all I'm trying to achieve. And I think I'm very pleased that Julie Glaister has already indicated that type of approach is already being put into place, which I'm very pleased to hear. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Mr. Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Councillor Fylde, can you just perhaps go back to the question you were asked earlier by one of the members, I think it was Councillor Clayton, when you were asked if any extra weight is given by comments made by parish and town councils, and of course they do it in the correct speak.
Councillor Fylde.
And the answer to the Deputy Mayor is exactly the same answer I gave originally to Councillor Clayton, I think it was. And it is not the messenger, it's the message. It's as simple as that. And those people who have been associated with the planning committee, the present DM committee, appreciate that just because it's a town council or a parish council making observations on a planning application, if the content of their comments are not of a planning nature, then the committee are obliged to disregard. So I can't be any simpler than to simply say it's the message, not the messenger.
Thank you. Does that answer your question, Mr. Deputy Mayor?
Sort of. I'm not very happy with that, but sort of. Thank you.
Councillor, sorry, Henshaw, Karen.
All this talk of public consultation, it almost makes me think it's a joke unless we do help people within the public to put forward the right sort of views and in the right sort of way. We're wasting our time. It's a total waste of time having a public consultation if the public themselves are not given guidance.
Thank you. Councillor Eaves.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have every sympathy with making this consultation simple for the residents of Fylde. And our officers are also aware of the need for help and guidance. And I want to give this council the assurance that I will be speaking with Chief Exec and members in order to ensure that that guidance is made as simple as possible and is taken full recognition of. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Councillor Clayton.
Yeah, just very quickly, Mr. Mayor. I was just following on from Councillor Armitt's point there, and one point that I would probably suggest is that that kind of information, when we look at the list at 3.3 about all the locations for the drop-in centres, officers there will surely, at that stage, be able to give that guidance. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Beckett.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, I seconded this motion. I would like to thank Councillor Fylde and the leader of the council, Councillor Eaves, for supporting it. I think it's got to be supported. The public have got to have as much information as they can, which is in the book. But even councillors can't understand this book if you're not on DC. And the more information that's given out and help when people do put the suggestions forward, I very much appreciate the willingness to take it on board. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Beckett. Councillor Chedd.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm afraid that Councillor Fidler's response a moment ago has prompted me to ask my question again. It seems it was directed at the officer last time, and I think it needs to be directed at the portfolio holder. Of the consultation responses that were received, I would like to know how many there were, how many were disregarded, to use Councillor Fidler's words, and how many were accepted and taken into consideration. Thank you.
Councillor Fidler.
Well, Mr. Mayor, I think having been prompted to ask that question, I think it's a totally redundant question in the view of the answer given by Julie Clayster to his original question. But I think the sentiment expressed by myself and the leader of the council in support of the amendment by Alan is agreed by all. But we've got to understand a weakness when you try and appreciate the results of such a consultation, even though you're giving them help. Because you could have a scenario where, we'll take Kirkham. I don't know why I say that, but I can feel Liz looking at me. You can ask people in Kirkham whether they are in favour of a particular development, and their answer is no, and give reasons why that shouldn't be the case. But there's also a consequence, isn't there? Because if you are directed at a strategic Fylde Borough level to deliver 7,000 houses, and you are being told by people who have a more parochial view on the way they respond, that they won't have those houses and won't accept houses in that particular area, of course the knock-on effect is that other areas have got to accommodate additional housing that those people in that particular area have refused. It's a complicated area, and at some level you've got to have someone who stands back, and this is the purpose of the government's guidance, is that at the end of the day this planning authority has to come up with a plan that's acceptable to all. And it is an extremely difficult exercise. But I, as again, repeating myself, applaud the amendment given by Alan.
Thank you. Does anybody else wish to speak before we put this to the vote?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, just very quickly to say that there are and have been quite a number of councillors either currently on or previously on the DM or DC committee. It is our job to represent the people that live in our wards. So I, for one, would be quite happy if somebody wants to come to me, one of my residents wants to come to me and have assistance in translating their feelings into proper planning speak on a non-parochial basis. And perhaps something could be, perhaps the officers could include that you know, if you need advice, contact your local councillor and they could put you in touch with a relatively local member of the DM or a previous member of the DC committee.
Thank you, Councillor Duffy. Overuse of the word parochial. Can we... Overuse generally. Can we put that to the vote by a show of hands for the amendment? That's very clearly carried. Is anybody against it? No. Thank you. Are there any more amendments? Councillor Clayton.
I don't think this one will be quite as easy, Mr. Mayor. If I could refer members to page 199 of the report. The table refers at the penultimate box to H13, land north of Mulberry Lane.
Parochial, is it, Councillor Clayton?
Could be, or it may not be, depending on how you look at it. I'd like to make an amendment to that box where it starts H13. Clearly, this area of land is currently subject to awaiting decision of the Secretary of State for the development that is currently in an application format. And I think until such times as we have that result of that inquiry, that this should be deferred within that table. And my amendment simply is to add at the end of where it reads H13, land north of Mulberry Lane, Westham, bracket housing, to add the words to be deferred subject to the decision of the Secretary of State. And I have a seconder for Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Councillor Beckett.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, I stand to second that decision. I honestly think that Councillor Clayton is quite right. If the decision is at the moment in the hands of the Secretary of State, I think it should be deferred until the decision is made.
Thank you. Does anybody wish to speak? No. Councillor Fylde?
What about it?
Try not to use the parochial word.
If you were passionate in your not him again, I'm quite happy not to participate. So, and you've got that button that you've not used yet. I understand the reason, obviously, from the Westham councillors that they would not want to complicate a decision about to be made by the Secretary of State or the local plan inspector, or not the local plan inspector, the inspector. Whether that is significant an amendment, I am not absolutely clear in my own mind, because the Mulberry Lane application that came before the DM committee was moved for approval by the officers, and at the appeal process the Fylde Borough was not represented, we displayed an obvious weakness in reasons why, as a planning authority, we did not want to defend Roebuck Lane. Part of the reason being that in the previous inspector's conclusions and report, when he dealt with the Roebuck Lane application, admittedly for a larger number of houses than the one that's currently before him, it was described by the inspector as being a more sustainable site.
Thank you. I think we're getting into detail of something. It's a handy button, that one. Thank you. Does anybody else wish to speak on the amendment? Councillor Ashton?
Mr. Mayor, I don't profess to be an expert on planning at all, but I'm looking at page 199 of the document, next to row. It in the second column it says strong development site and a recent application for 100 dwellings on the part of the site will be determined by the Secretary of State. Surely does that not take into account the fact that there's an inquiry or a decision awaited by the Secretary of State? And I would have thought that was sufficient for any stakeholder who's looking at this document that we're consulting with to take that into account. As I say, I don't profess to be an expert, but I would have thought that would help members and give them some comfort that we have actually referred to the Secretary of State on page 199. And it's H13 land north of Mobeck Lane, Westham, in brackets housing. Thanks, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Councillor Clayton.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think I agree with that last comment, Mr. Mayor, but I think my amendment is simply to consolidate that next column. And because this is in the hands of the inspector and the Secretary of State will make the final resultant decision, I can't see any reason why we do not make more emphasis on the deferment until such times as that decision comes in. I think we do automatically accept if the decision is that the development is to go ahead, so be it. We all know the feeling of the people of Westham that it shouldn't go ahead, but nevertheless, I think we should defer it until such times as that decision is finally made by the inspector. It's just a consolidation exercise.
Thank you.
Mayor.
If I'm allowed, I totally agree. Councillor Fylde.
I've turned the machine back on. I don't think there's anything to be gained. I can understand why the ward councillors, the mayor and Alan, want to go down this route. But in the real world, I don't think there's anything material or significant to be gained by deferring it at this time. We are expecting the inspector's report in the next week or 2 weeks.
Thank you. Can we take a vote on that amendment, please, for the amendment? Against the amendment?
That amendment fails. There are 11 for the amendment and 26 against.
I'm not going to say thank you. Councillor Andrews.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Could I just draw your attention to page 21, paragraph 2.53. I have a concern here where it says that the prices in rural areas are typically higher than other areas in the Fylde. This means that the provision of affordable housing is a significant issue throughout the rural areas, with demand outstripping supply. This is demonstrably not the case in Ray Green, and Ray Green is a rural area, so I suggest that that paragraph be altered. On page 105, in the policy H3, under affordable housing, on the third paragraph down, it says for residential developments adjacent to rural areas which include Ray Green, the provision of affordable housing will be met by the requirements identified for that settlement. I'm entirely happy with that statement, but the paragraph on page 21 is inaccurate.
Thank you. Do you wish to make that an amendment?
Yeah, I would suggest that if you just insert the word some before rule, I think it'll be then all right, but it's wrong at the moment.
To the Mayor, Frank, which is the paragraph you're referring
It's
to?
right, page 21, para 2.53.
It's the same one.
It says this is a significant issue throughout the rural areas. You have to say some rural areas, and then you can get away with the statement on 105.
Councillor Fidler, do you want to comment?
I think we can appreciate where Frank is coming from, but I don't think its significance warrants an amendment to the wording.
Councillor Andrews, do you have a seconder for that if you wish to make that an amendment?
Oh, I've no idea. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I doubt it.
Yeah, you've got a seconder. If you wish to make that an amendment, simply inserting the word some.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, I do.
Thank you. Thank you. Seconder, would you like to speak? No, thank you. Anybody else want to speak?
Well, Mr. Mayor, if you did add the word some, you're simply saying that Ray Green hasn't got a problem with affordable housing. And I think the concept that's within 2.53, that there is a significant issue of the provision of affordable housing throughout rural Fylde, is a statement that I think has universal support. I don't think you could then start to focus down on particular areas, as your amendment would imply, that Ray Green is in some way the provision of affordable housing is not important in Ray Green, and I don't think your amendment justifies the impact on that existing wording.
We have an amendment before us. Shall we just put it to the vote? Sorry, Councillor Aitken.
While appreciating Councillor Andrews' sentiments and the fact that Ray Green doesn't want to have affordable housing because he's still got one affordable housing that hasn't been utilised, we're sympathetic towards the needs of Ray Green. Does it warrant this change? And the fact remains that surely your parish council could make amendments, put them forward, because this is a consultation period that we're going into. Does it need a vote?
Thank you, but this is a democracy. Councillor Andrews.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Can I just remind you what I said, that the paragraph in 2.53, as it stands at the moment, is incorrect. It's incorrect because we had affordable housing available and empty, brand new, attractive affordable housing for 8 months because no tenant could be found. And if affordable housing is that available, you cannot make the statement that you have made in 2.53. That is why I suggest you insert the word some, which then makes it possible.
Thank you. I'm going to put that to the vote by a show of hands for the amendment. Against the amendment?
So that fails.
Thank you. Even the microphone's lost the will to live. Are there any more amendments? Does anybody else wish to speak on any, not on any subject, but on this subject? Councillor Duffy.
Yes, I would just like to thank you, Mr. Mayor, for the way that you chaired the meeting tonight, and also thank Councillor Fylde for bearing with us and giving the comprehensive answers that he did. We may not have agreed with all of them, but thank you for doing that. I thought it was a productive debate tonight, better than it would have been. I wouldn't want every debate to be like this, but I thought it was very useful tonight, and thanks for your good chairmanship tonight, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Oh. Thank you. Councillor Rhodes.
Are we moving back to the substantive motion? Thank you.
We are. Thank you. So we're now moving back to, I don't think any of the amendments, oh yes, we did, one. Councillor Clayton's amendment to be added to the original proposition. So, Councillor Fylde, would you like to put that?
Yeah.
Is this?
I don't
No.
know.
Oh no, sorry, no. Any speakers on the substantive motion? Councillor Rhodes.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Well, I think we all know that the decision on the local plan is a portfolio holder decision. An LDF group was created, and I just believe that was created to give this plan some democratic credibility. When the LDF group was created, I'm sure that we all thought that Councillor Fylde would take on board our feedback and views. But this only seems to have applied if he agreed with those views. When the LDF group had views different from officers and the portfolio holder on several occasions, they weren't minuted and were disregarded. And I believe that this group was created to give democratic credibility to the local plan process, but democracy was only allowed if our views tallied with theirs. Councillor Fylde has accused me of being parochial on several occasions when I attempted to get open countryside areas removed from the plan. Areas which appeared at the last minute and which had not been previously considered by the LDF group. Even though I got the support of the majority of the committee, he disregarded our views. I have consistently refused to support development on greenfield sites in open countryside areas. Several Conservative councillors have emailed me in the last year or two to thank me for my assistance in getting applications refused, but I won't embarrass them tonight by naming them, for they all know who they are. This being the case, I'm obviously going to object to building on greenfield sites in Kirkham and Wesham. This doesn't make me parochial. I'm passionate about keeping Fylde, and particularly Kirkham and Wesham, the green and pleasant areas we now live in. I'm passionate about retaining the local characteristics of our towns and villages. I'm told that at the last DC meeting, Councillor Pounder tried to ensure that his patch didn't receive inappropriate development, and I'm advised that he then moved approval of several applications in other parts of the borough. Now that, in my opinion, is parochial. Councillor Fylde and several other members in here tonight don't have to worry about being parochial. There's no building on countryside areas in Freckleton. What a fortunate position to be in. I realise that Fylde has to have building because of government diktat, and know that Kirkham and Wesham must take a share of the development. But enough brownfield sites can be found to accommodate the building, and it's these areas which should be developed first. We shouldn't be breaching settlement boundaries to use open countryside. A boundary which has a hard edge, which is the bypass, one of the strongest and easiest boundaries to protect. I warn all of you here tonight, if this is agreed, there's not an area of open countryside in this borough which is safe from developers, whether they have orange splodges on them or not, Councillor Aitken. As previously stated, I believe we have an oversupply of employment land, several areas of which could be used for housing development. I will move that I cannot accept this plan in its present form. I do not support it, and I move that we don't support it tonight and request a recorded vote.
Thank you, Councillor Rhodes. Councillor Aitken. Thank you.
Councillor Odes, at the last but one LDF meeting, you put forward that you didn't want to build on the Kirkham Triangle. And you got quite a lot of support from the LDF steering group. You accepted the Dowbridge 240 houses, which was 7% of the total build for the whole of Fylde. And we went away to discuss and to look at the situation and to see if we could possibly get the Kirkham Triangle out of the equation. Bearing in mind that if you look at your map at the back, you'll see the Kirkham Triangle is for mixed development of 295 houses plus some employment. Now, Councillor Fylde went away, and the officers also went away, looked at the facts and figures, and we had a presentation. That's Councillor Fylde, myself, and Councillor Easton. Now, Councillor Fylde went to this particular meeting with a very open mind, and he wasn't under the opinion that there may be a possibility we could actually get Kirkham Triangle out of the equation. At the end of the actual matrix deliberations, etc., he was soundly of the knowledge that the Kirkham Triangle had to be in. And bear in mind that it was for 295 houses, in total 535 houses for Kirkham up till 2030, which is 11% of the total of Fylde. Now, Councillor Fylde was very, very careful how he examined all these facts and figures. Now, somewhere else would have to take the actual building if we didn't have the small amount of development in Kirkham. Somewhere else would have to take that. So in defence, he does take notice of what people say in the LDF steering group meetings. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Ashton.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I'd like to just follow up on what Councillor Odes has been saying about Kirkham and Wesham. Nationally, we've got a housing shortage of about 100,000 houses each year. So I think Fylde has to do its bit to supply these houses. And the question I'd ask you all is, where are my children going to live? I've got a 17-year-old, a 24-year-old and a 25-year-old. And I want them to be able to own their own house like I do. And I want to make sure that there are sufficient houses, not only in Fylde but in the rest of the country, to provide the housing that our children so desperately need. There's another reason I want to see housing, and that's to create jobs. I'm absolutely keen on economic development. Not only the employment of the people building the houses, the plumbers, the plasterers, the bricklayers, but also the employment that will be provided by the employment areas alongside the housing. Also, Kirkham and Wesham is probably one of the most sustainable areas in Fylde, having a shopping centre, a railway that's soon to become electrified on a main line, and the M55 motorway on its doorstep. It's also on a strategic bus route and is well served by public transport. What I think members have got to try and do in that area is make sure that they get either benefit from the new to arrive community infrastructure levy, or at the moment there's section 106 money that's available, and make sure that they do get improvements in their towns and villages when they do have construction in their area. Also, I'm a great believer in making sure that any funding that comes to an area, and Councillor Odes has been quite vociferous about making sure funding does come to Kirkham Town Centre, is actually sustainable. It's no use just having one-off grants, and we've seen it in East Lancashire, where over the last 10 years, there's been about £1 billion invested in East Lancashire. Now, I think it's been invested in the wrong areas, and it's not been invested in creating jobs which are sustainable. And that's what this house building will bring us, and this employment land, sustainable income to make sure that actually we improve our town centres and going forward. We've got to make sure that all members of the council get involved in this consultation process and make sure that all the members in their area, all the residents in their areas do so as well, and making sure stakeholders do respond to this consultation. That's what it's about tonight, making sure that we have a robust consultation process that cannot be criticised. We've talked a lot about individual sites, but I think really we're missing the point as a council. We've got to make sure that we have a consultation process that cannot be criticised, and make sure that any person in our borough can have their say. And I think we're doing a damn good job of it tonight. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you for putting us straight on our areas, Councillor Ashton. Councillor Pounder.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'd like to come back on the comments that was made by Councillor Oates. I didn't vote against the planning in my own area. I asked for a site visit. Right. The answer, the applications I agreed to was one in Wheaton, which is also my ward, and as a result of that, the village is getting a brand new village hall. So it was because the residents of the area had said that that was their request, and that was the case. The reason we're fighting so hard in staying in for these extra houses is, you heard there that the houses being done at Kirkham would create 11%. If these houses go forward that are up for application now, Staining will have had more than 11% in the last 12 months that are not sustainable. The school cannot take any more. There is only one village shop and an half-hourly bus service.
Thank you, Councillor Pounder. Mr. Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'd like to come back on a couple of comments made by Councillor Fylde and Councillor Ashton. And I think it was actually Councillor Aitken that said Kirkham has had 11%, or the figure, if this development goes ahead, will account for 11% until 2030. What isn't being stated here is how many houses Kirkham and Weston have already accepted over the past 10, 20 years. What we are also challenging is the fact that we're saying we're not averse to housing. We keep being accused of being parochial. What we are saying is any housing that goes in the Kirkham Weston area should go onto the brownfield sites that are available. I am also a little bit confused about a statement that Councillor Fylde in the press recently, I think it was last week, where he's describing Kirkham's High Street as very fragile. Now that actually contradicts a statement that the leader of the council has said, where he's describing, when referring to the High Street Innovation Fund, that our high streets in the borough are buoyant. Now that is confusing to our residents that we are asking to come out to consultation. It's a little bit sending out conflicting messages from this council. What I would say to Councillor Fylde, if you truly think that the building of these houses that are in this local plan, if you really think that those houses would have a positive impact on the high street, I really think you're getting a little bit confused there, Councillor Fylde. What you should be looking at is the fact that Kirkham High Street hasn't had the economic development required over the past decades. We're dealing with a recession. Kirkham High Street's no different from any high street in the country. We're looking at having to contend with the internet, out-of-town retail sites. So really, if you think that that's the magic wand to suddenly breathe some life into a high street, I think you should be looking at Freckleton Village Centre and considering some houses near Freckleton. What I would also like to say is it's such a shame that we, as Kirkham Town Council, were given the assurance at the Remembrance Sunday service last year by our MP that we had no need to be concerned about the Kirkham Triangle. To quote him, he said it hadn't got a cat in hell's chance of going through. However, he was concerned about Mowbray. Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Silverwood. Councillor Beckett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. With the argument about building the two sites in Kirkham, first of all, both sites are on floodplains. Now, I've got a great grievance about these two sites where they're going to build them in Kirkham. Bottom of Doorbridge is a floodplain. It's on your maps, you can see it in all the papers been given to you. The other site on the triangle is even worse. That site at the top of the triangle is the hub where all the water coming out from Ray Green comes down, floods all over the Blackpool Road into that piece of land where that site is. That site naturally soaks it up and lets it go into Wrongway Brook. All the water from Wrongway Brook circles around Kirkham, with all the water coming in from Ray Green, from Westham, with the new development that we're waiting for the thing on that. Got a councillor down there, Councillor Trelfall, who's on the environmental. He's fighting for floodplains to be sorted out. Well, them two sites are floodplains. One of the sites hasn't even got a bus route. Answer to the one down there. So, I'm seriously, and I will not support this document one bit, because them two sites are not fit for housing. And if you want to put houses on them, who's going to insure them? Nobody.
Thank you, Councillor Beckett. Councillor Rhodes.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I would just like to come back on something that Councillor Pounder said. He said that Staining had taken 11% of the borough's housing need. I think perhaps he's confused with an 11% increase perhaps of Staining. And I would say that we're working out at the present time the amount Kirkham and Westham have taken in recent years. I think the report says we would be taking 18% of the borough's needs if we accept this housing. But when you take what we've had in recent years and you look at the size of our two towns, I think you'll find that the increase to the size of the two towns is exponential, and that is what concerns us, particularly when you consider that we've had no extra doctors, no extra schools, no extra infrastructure, and there's none planned with any new development. You can understand why we're so annoyed. The points that we're making will be made very, very strongly at the consultation period. I don't really think tonight is the time to make them.
Thank you, Councillor Rhodes. Does anybody... Oh, Councillor Ashton.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. As we've suspended standing orders, I think I'll have a second shot at this. I've got to take on the Deputy Mayor in a point about extra housing won't help the High Street in Kirkham. If there was one house in Kirkham, only one house only, there'd be no trade on the High Street. If there were 1 million houses in Kirkham, there'll be plenty of trade on the High Street. Now, somewhere between 1 and 1 million, there'll be a number of houses that will sustain Kirkham High Street. And I don't believe the number of houses are sufficient yet. Therefore, logic says that more houses are needed in Kirkham. The second point I'd just like to take on is about the conflict of the reports in the press, from what Councillor Fylde says and what Councillor Eves says. And it just goes to show you can't believe all you read in the press. Because many a time I've been misquoted and quoted wrongly in the press. I'm used to it, don't worry, I'm used to it. So what I'd say to you is please don't believe all you read in the press. The third point I'd like to make, I believe in a recent history, Kirkham has taken about 7% of new dwellings in the borough. That's the recent statistic I've been given. If the proposal goes ahead with this local plan for the future development of Kirkham, it'll increase to about 11% of the total increase in dwellings in this borough. And the final point I'd just like to take on is a doctors and dentists point. This is where local councillors must have their voice heard. If in your area you are to have more development, then make sure that you shout loud and clearly that you need more doctors, more dentists, a bus service, or whatever it is you feel you're short of. That's your role as a local member, is to make sure you shout up for your residents. If you think there's inadequacies in your area, then please be vociferous about them. That's our job.
Thank you, Councillor Ashton. I think you must not have heard us, or you must not have read the right press. Councillor Silverwood.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think it was predictable that Councillor Ashton would come back as a retort on the comments I made. With regard to the quotes in the press, it's a joke really, isn't it, when you're in the privileged position of having a press officer. So if you can't believe what's quoted from you from the press officer, then I'm hugely concerned. The next thing, if you'd attended the DM meeting when the Kirkham Triangle came to the committee, one of the residents from St George's spoke at the DM meeting, and he's an ex-officer at Preston City Council. He's an extremely eloquent man, and he spoke incredibly well that day against the Kirkham Triangle. And what he actually said, and he was rather embarrassed in saying it, is that he'd done his own study on the residents of St George's. Now, St George's, for anybody who knows Kirkham, is within our boundaries. And he said he was ashamed to say that less than 5% of those residents on St George's use Kirkham High Street. In fact, what he actually said was they jump in the car and they go 2 miles down the road to Tesco, they go to Lytham, or they go to Preston. That is a St George's resident. That isn't a resident from Lytham. You're from Lytham. I'm sorry you don't know what goes on in Kirkham.
Thank you, Councillor Silverwood. Last one, Councillor Rhodes.
Well, I have to come back to Councillor Ashton because he talks about logic. And I can remember about 20 to 30 years ago when Kirkham had much fewer houses, we had a full high street that was thriving. So if more houses create more business, it's not working because our shops are suffering the same as everybody else's, except perhaps Lytham. And I don't think you find anybody with bigger gobs than Elaine Silverwood and myself. And we do shout, and we've not managed to get extra doctors or dentists. But I'm sure you've achieved it for Lytham. Have you, Councillor Ashton? And finally, the percentage increase that Kirkham and Westham have taken is far greater than 7%.
Sorry, I can't turn Councillor Rhodes off because she's on a roving mic.
Can we please respect the position of the Mayor, please?
Yeah,
One person at a time speaking.
It's not preferential treatment. I couldn't turn the roving mic off. So perhaps the sooner we get more mics, the better. Sorry, Councillor Rhodes. Councillor Wilson, you haven't spoken. Do you wish to speak?
Tonight, to the best of my knowledge, we are not actually endorsing the Fylde Local Plan to 2030 Part 1. What we preferred options, but what we are endorsing with the recommendation tonight is that we endorse that this draft goes to public consultation. And during the public consultation, I think that's the opportunity for everyone who is happy or unhappy with anything in the preferred options to make their voices heard, so that when the consultation is completed and the actual plan comes to this council, that will be the time when we can debate the parts in the plan that we might not want to have in it or want to have extended. But tonight it's just to get the consultation process started.
Thank you, Councillor Wilson. Right, Councillor Fylde, the floor is yours to sum up, please.
Can you turn me off now, please?
With pleasure.
Well, I think we can all appreciate the ward councillors, Councillor Silverwood and Olds, commenting as they have done. But I am really rather disappointed, because as the portfolio holder and his relationship with the LDS steering group, no other council has gone down the route of inviting the entire planning committee to be part of that steering group. And can I just point out, where Liz O says that if the portfolio holder didn't agree with the steering group, then he just overrode them. The document before you this evening is so many pages, 15 chapters, and universal support on 99%. The only area that caused conflict was the protection by the ward councillors of the Kirkham Triangle. And I do get upset when comments are made that I just disregarded the committee's preferred decision and option. In the March meeting, I indeed supported verbally the concept that we should, if we could, protect the Kirkham Triangle from development. And that was based on the fact that, one, connectivity to the existing residents, and two, that the Kirkham bypass was a hard boundary and under normal planning circumstances should be the boundary, and further development to the west of that should be prevented. A consequence of that meeting, I asked the officers to re-look at the Kirkham Triangle to see if they could accommodate that proportion of housing that was designated for that area in other areas of the Fylde. We had a subsequent meeting, as Councillor Aiken described, with all the planning officers present, and they came to a very strong conclusion, which persuaded me along the route that I have taken. And their conclusion was, because Kirkham was deemed to be probably the most sustainable area for development in Fylde Borough, not only did it have transport links with the rail, with the motorway and the roads around it, but it had been designated as a transport hub by Lancashire County Council. If we'd have gone down the route of trying to accommodate that housing elsewhere within the borough, our officers gave a very strong warning that that local plan, without the Kirkham Triangle, was deemed to be unsound. And if your plan is found to be unsound, as I touched on in the introduction, that causes considerable delay at great expense. My decision to include the Kirkham Triangle.
Sorry,
Councillor. It's a very important point.
Yes.
The fact that the...
Can we move to summing up the I totally agree with you that it's a very important point, but I think it has been well covered.
Well, it hasn't been well covered because I'm just introducing it for the very first time. The fact that the Kirkham Triangle is in the document this evening allows the public to be tested on whether or not they have an opinion about it. And when that planning application came to the DM for the Kirkham Triangle, unlike Ray Green, unlike Westham, unlike St Anne's with the QED, very few people objected to those proposals within those applications. Turn me off.
Thank you. I've turned you off. Thank you. Do you have anything else to say before we put the substantive motion to the vote? Councillor Fylde? No?
No.
Thank you. Tracy will read the recommendation.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, just to clarify, we're turning our attention to the two recommendations now on page 3 of the agenda. Recommendations 1 and 2 moved originally by Councillor Fylde and seconded by Councillor Eaves, with that wording that was added by Councillor Clayton in that all methods of communication and at every opportunity in all methods of communication, every opportunity, full guidance will be provided on the format in which comments should be submitted.
I think I have a request from Councillor Rhodes for a recorded vote. Have you got 5? Thank you. So it will be a recorded vote. Thank you. Those in favour of the recommendations?
Sorry.
Sorry. For or against the recommendation? Sorry. Yeah, it's.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, if members could indicate if they are voting for, against or abstaining. Mr. Mayor?
Against.
Councillor Silverwood? Against. Councillor Ackers? Councillor Aitken? Councillor Ackroyd? Councillor Andrews? Councillor Armitt? Councillor Ashton? Councillor Beckett? Councillor Brickles? Councillor Chedd? Councillor Chew? Councillor Clayton? Councillor Craig Wilson? Councillor John Davis? Councillor Donaldson? Councillor Duffy? Councillor Eaves? Councillor Fazakerley? Councillor Fydler?
For.
Councillor Ford? Councillor Goodman? Councillor Goodrich? Councillor Harper? Councillor Howard Henshaw? Councillor Karen Henshaw? Councillor Paul Hodgson? Councillor Jakes? Councillor Little? Councillor Barbara Nash? Councillor Edward Nash? Councillor Odes? Councillor Pounder? Councillor Presswich? Councillor Redcliffe? Councillor Rigby? Councillor Speak? Councillor Threlfall? And Councillor Wilder. Okay, just one moment.
Right.
Mr. Mayor, that is carried with 23 for and 16 against.
Thank you. Can I thank you all for your patience and for your contributions tonight. Can I also say that this is the last time you'll be seeing these big chairs in my reign because I can't cope with them. Anybody else wants them, they can have them, but while I'm up here, I can't cope with it. Thank you.